you get into squabbles on small things. I've seen deals fall apart because people start arguing about some unimportant point, and then their egos get involved, and they draw lines in the sand and all of that. Negotiations that drag out have a tendency, they're more likely to blow up for some reason. I mean, people, they can get obstinate about very small points, and it's silly to be obstinate, but people get silly sometimes. So I like to keep things moving. I like to show a certain amount of trust in the other person, because usually trust comes back to you.
Warren and Charlie, you're famous for making a deal over a day or two with nothing more than a handshake. You pride yourself on the small overhead of doing the diligence mostly yourself. Other successful acquisitive companies use teams of internal people, outside bankers, consultants, and lawyers to do diligence, often over many months, to assess deals. Speed may be a competitive advantage. You've done some amazing deals. But does your diligence process also put us at greater risk? And if you're ever gone, how would you recommend Berkshire change how we approach deal making?
Yeah, I get that question fairly often, often from lawyers. In fact, we talked to Munger Tolles, the law firm, and that was one of the questions I got, why we didn't do more due diligence, which we would have paid them by the hour for. It's interesting. We've made plenty of mistakes in acquisitions, plenty, and we made mistakes in not making acquisition. But the mistakes are always about making an improper assessment of the economic conditions in the future of the industry or the company. They're not a bad lease. They're not a specific labor contract. They're not a questionable patent. They're not the things that are on the checklist, for every acquisition by every major corporation in America. Those are not the things that count. What counts is whether you're wrong about whether you really got a fix on the basic economics and how the industry is likely to develop, or whether Amazon's likely to kill them, in a few years, or that sort of thing. And we have not found a due diligence list that gets at what we think are the real risks when we buy a business. And like I said, we certainly made at least a half a dozen mistakes, and probably a lot more if you get into mistakes of omission. But none of those would have been cured by a lot more due diligence. They might have been cured by us being a little smarter. It just isn't the things that are on the checklist that really count. Assessing whether a manager who I'm going to hand $1 billion to for his business, and he is going to hand me a stock certificate, assessing whether he's going to behave differently in the future in running that business than he has in the past when he owned it, that's incredibly important. But there's no checklist in the world that's going to answer that. So if we thought there were items of due diligence, and incidentally there are a few that get covered. I mean, you want to make sure that they don't have twice as many shares out as you're buying or something of the sort. But if we thought there were things that we were missing that were of importance in assessing the future economic prospects of the business, we would by all means drill down on those. But the question of, when we bought Seas, they probably had 150 leases. When we buy Precision Cash Parts, they have 170 plants. There's going to be pollution problems at some place, and that is not what determines whether a $32 billion acquisition is going to look good 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And we try to focus on those things. And I do think it probably facilitates things with at least certain people that our method of operation does cut down. You get into squabbles on small things. I've seen deals fall apart because people start arguing about some unimportant point, and their egos get involved, and and they draw lines in the sand and all of that. I think we gain a lot. When we start to make a deal, it usually gets done. Charlie?
Well, if you stop to think about it, business quality usually counts on something more than whether you crossed a T in some old lease or something. And the human quality of the management who are going to stay are very important. And how are you going to check that? As by due diligence, And I don't know anybody who's had a generally better record than Berkshire in judging business quality and the human quality of the people who are going to lead the business after it was acquired. And I don't think it would have improved at all by using some different method. So I think the answer is that, for us at least, we're doing it the way we should.
Negotiations that drag out have a tendency, they're more likely to blow up for some reason. I mean, people, they can get obstinate about very small points, and it's silly to be obstinate, but people get silly sometimes. So I like to keep things moving. I like to show a certain amount of trust in the other person, because usually trust comes back to you. But the truth is there's some bad apples out there, and spotting them is not going to come from looking at documents. You really have to size up whether that person who's getting a lot of cash from you how they're going to behave in the future, because we're counting on them, and that assessment is as important as anything involved. We know all the figures and everything going in, and we know what we'll pay, and so we don't want things to get gummed up in negotiations. And I'm perfectly willing to lose small points here and then on a deal if I have the deal on the right terms. I don't believe in making and Tom Murphy taught me this. I mean, you just don't try and win every point. It's a terrible mistake. But you make a decent deal, and if you find something that bends a little different some way, that's okay. If you think it's bad faith and gives an indication of the character of the person you're dealing with, then you got another problem, and you're lucky if you find that out early. Charlie, any more?
How many people who in this room who are happily married carefully check their spouse's birth certificate and so on? My guess is that our methods are not so uncommon as they appear.
Yeah. I'll think about that.
What obvious truth presents itself so clearly to you, but many would fervently disagree with you upon?
I think I got the question, and I owe a great deal to Ben Graham in terms of learning about investing, and I owe a great deal to Charlie in terms of learning a lot about business. And then I've also been around. I mean, I've spent a lifetime, looking at businesses and why some work and why some don't work. As Yogi Berra said, you can see a lot just by observing, and that's pretty much what Charlie and I have been doing for a long time. And I mentioned pattern recognition earlier. And I would say it's important to recognize what you can't do. So we may have tried the department store business and a few things, but we've generally tried to only swing at things in the strike zone, and our particular strike zone. And it really hasn't been much more complicated than that. You don't need the IQ in the investment business that you need in certain activities in life. But you do have to have emotional control. I mean, we see very smart people do very stupid things, and it's fascinating how humans do that. Just take the people that get very rich and then leverage themselves up in some way that they lose everything. I mean, they're risking something that's important to them for something that isn't important to them. Well, you can say you could figure that one out in first grade, but people do it time after time. And you see that constantly, self-destructive behavior of one sort or another. I think we've probably, and it doesn't take a genius to do it, but I think we've sort of avoided the self-destructive behavior. Charlie?
Well, there's just a few simple tricks that work well, and particularly if you've got a temperament that has a combination of patience and opportunism in it. And I think that's largely inherited, although I suppose it can be learned to some extent. Then I think there's another factor that accounts for the fact that Berkshire's done as well as it has, is that we're really trying to behave well. And I had a great-grandfather, when he died, the preacher gave the talk, and he said, none envied this man's success so fairly won and wisely used. Now, that's a very simple idea, but it's exactly what Berkshire's trying to do. There are a lot of people who make a lot of money, and everybody hates them, and they don't admire the way they earn the money. And I'm not particularly admirable at making money running gambling casinos. And you know, we don't own any. And we've turned down businesses, including a big tobacco business. So I don't think Berkshire would work as well if we were just terribly shrewd, but didn't have a little bit of what the preacher said about my grandfather Ingham. We want to have people think of us as having won fairly and used wisely. It works.
And we were very, very lucky to be born when we were and where we were.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, you could have dropped us at some other place in time or some other part of the world, and things would have turned out.
And think of how lucky you were to have your Uncle Fred. Warren had an uncle who was one of the finest men I ever knew. I used to work for him, too. You know, a lot of people have terrible relatives.
That's not an unimportant point. Just yesterday, we had a meeting of all my cousins and a whole bunch that we just get together at the annual meeting time. There are probably 40 of us or 50 of us there, and they were pulling out some old pictures, and I had 4 aunts. They were all in these pictures, and every one of them, you know, I mean, you were so lucky if you had one like that, and I had 4. I mean, they just were, in every way, they reinforced a lot of things that needed some reinforcement in my case.
I wish you'd had a couple more.
But
we'd be doing even better.
But he mentioned my Uncle Fred, but my Aunt Katie worked in the store too. My Aunt Alice worked in the store, and you just couldn't have been around better people. I think Charlie would agree with that.
Yeah, well, we were very lucky.
Yeah. My grandfather was a little tough, however. Tell him what my grandfather used to do when he paid you on Saturday, Charlie.
Well, that was very interesting. You know, Warren's a Democrat, but he came from different antecedents. I worked for his grandfather, Ernest, and he was earnest. And when they passed Social Security, which he disapproved of because he thought it reduced self-reliance, and he paid me $2 for 10 hours work. There was no minimum wage in those days on Saturday, and it was a hard 10 hours. At the end of the 10 hours, I came in, and he made me give him 2 pennies, which was my contribution to Social Security. And he gave me 2 $1 bills and a long lecture about the evils of Democrats and the welfare state and the lack of self-reliance, and it went on and on and on and on. So I had the right antecedents, too. I had Ernest Buffett telling me what to do.
Okay, enough family history.
I haven't overstated that, have I?
No, you haven't overstated it at all. No.
You can't believe it, people. And he thought he was doing his duty by the world to do that.
But we were lucky, Dad. The people we were around when we were young, we were very lucky.